organization too. So I'm wondering about how do we communicate back our findings in an equitable way? And there weren't many resources about that. So what we did is our organization went out and we did a lot of research. We looked across sectors. We looked at equity organizations who are really intentionally incorporating language justice. We looked at research groups. We looked at other organizations who are thinking about communications and marketing and how to include equity. So we brought all these diverse pieces together to create a guide from that research. And so we're sharing with you some of that research today and what we're learning. And I do want to give a shout out to Kayla Bovair, who's a senior associate here with us at Innovation Network, who did these beautiful illustrations that you'll see in our presentation today. And you'll hear from my colleague, Shelli, shortly. So hi, Shelli. I'm glad you're here as well. So what do we mean when we say equitable communications? So when we talk about this, I mentioned, this is a final phase of the evaluation life cycle that we're talking about. And when we think about equitable communications, we mean that we want to communicate in a way that's accessible, engaging, and relevant, particularly for the communities who are contributing to our studies. And for this conversation, I want us to think about equitable communications as shifting two things. We want to be shifting our priorities and responsibility. So one, priorities, right? Shifting the priority to sharing our findings in a way that they can really benefit those individuals and communities who are contributing to our evaluations and the studies in minds. We're an external firm. We work with philanthropy a lot. And we absolutely see that the majority of our reporting goes to funders. So how can we shift that dynamic so that we're making sure we're communicating to folks who can really make use of this information and data, right? Like the people on the ground whose information you're collecting. We're also talking about shifting the responsibility to ourselves so that we're making sure that the way we communicate out our findings, that they are accessible. We're breaking down those barriers to accessing and using the information so that we're not just kind of putting a report out there and be like, oh my gosh, here it is, here's all this great information, anyone can access it, it's public, it's on the website. And I mean, the reality is a lot of times people are not reading those long reports, right? It's 100 pages, no one's reading it. We should not be surprised. It's the responsibility is on us to make sure that information is shared in a way that is useful and accessible for the people who can use that information and use it in their work. So making sure we're taking responsibility for that information to be used. So I want to give some language here too, because as I said, we work a lot of times with folks who don't really buy into this idea of having reporting that goes out to people. And so we're also trying to experiment with different language about how can we try to help folks see what is the benefit and value of communicating in an equitable way. And we think it's important to really prioritize equitable communications, even though it can mean more time, skill, money to do it. We think it should be non-negotiable because it really allows us to be more authentic in the way that we share our findings. It's more inclusive and respectful. It can reflect the diverse reality and uplift the world we want to see in the future, right? We're modeling that for others. And it can also give a platform and make sure that we're in relationship with people who are contributing to our evaluation. So that is not so extractive. This is more of a conversation that we're part of. And the bottom line is really that the world functions better when there's equity in the world, right? We want to use equitable communications to improve the reach, learning, and impact of data, and using an equitable approach to do that. But we're all learning. This is not something that any of us are really good at. As I said, like we're compiling and sharing back some lessons from research that we've done on this. We're still very much trying to figure out what that means and what that looks like in action and applying it to our own practice. And that's partly why we're here to talk to you all, because we also know that so many of you are trying to implement some of these practices yourselves. And so please use the chat to share any additional resources that you have, new ideas. I think we can all come together to learn from each other about how to communicate in an equitable way. So yeah, so please use the chat to connect with each other. And I'm just grateful to be like in conversation with you all today. And so launching into the how do you communicate equitably? What did we learn from our research? There are 4 guideposts that we'll be sharing, and I'll invite Shelli to start sharing about those shortly. But just a quick reminder before we dig in. Equitable communications relies on your data already having been collected in an equitable way. Like what we're talking about today does not replace bias trainings, data equity guidelines, or employing anti-racist strategies, right? Like we're coming in at the end of that evaluation life cycle. So you cannot communicate bias data equitably. So we're coming in with the assumption of like you've already been practicing some equitable evaluation approaches, and now you're ready to share back some of those findings. All right, so Shelli, I'd love to invite you to start sharing more about what we learned.
Awesome. Thank you, Alissa. So as Alissa mentioned earlier, we conducted some pretty deep research to identify these guideposts for equitable communications. We noticed that there was a gap in our understanding that we wanted to fill and that we wanted to share. And so from this research, we identified 4 guideposts that we're going to talk about today. These have come from diverse fields, diverse sources, but they're all related to communicating equitably. And what you'll notice about these guideposts is that they're not a how-to checklist. Like sometimes we're looking for like, just tell me what to do. What do I need to do so that I can say, I did these things, I checked the box. But that's not what these are. These are mindset shifts that are long-term. That's a way for us to actually change the way that we think individually. And some of these you will see and think, okay, I'm already doing this. And some may think, oh, I haven't started this yet or hadn't thought about that. But we feel that these are all important ways of thinking that we should collectively be striving for. Because that way, equitable communications is not itself a checkbox with our work, but rather is incorporated into the way that we think. And so we're going to dive deep into each of these guideposts and share just a few strategies that can help us to practice each one. We won't go too far because we do want you to be able to read the guide yourself and really get in there. But yeah, we will at least get in there and share some strategies for you. So let's jump in and move ahead to slide 8. So the first one is to develop a practice of self-reflection. This is so important. And as evaluators, we've heard this. We've heard about reflexivity. We've heard about this, but it's so important in communications because we have to recognize that this is a learning journey, just like that visual that showed, the person tripping right over that rock. This is a learning journey. It requires intention. And to be intentional in our work, we have to authentically reflect on our own thoughts, the way that we feel, and our own biases that we all hold. And we have to do this regularly, not just at the start, but throughout the work that we do. And so what we mean when we say this is that we must be willing to challenge our preconceived notions and even intentionally, like on purpose, re-educate ourselves when we are embarking on this journey, because it exists beyond textbooks. So how do we do this? Well, let's jump into some strategies. So here are 2 strategies that we have shared. One is that we can communicate more equitably by understanding ourselves. And that sounds like probably, oh, well, that's easy to do. But we need to better understand ourselves, how we think, how we feel, how we got to that thinking and those feelings. And then we also want to understand those around us and how our communications can affect others and how it affects us. And this could involve deeply reflecting on what others' experiences have been like, even if it means that we're thinking about experiences that we have not had ourselves. What has our own cultural history been like? We're going to go a little bit deeper into this strategy in a second, and we will give you some like specific ways that you can do this. But that's very important, understanding ourselves and others. Also, again, we're walking. This is a journey. There are different rocks and boulders in front of us that we're also trying to get around. We must acknowledge our own limitations. This requires a lot of humility in recognizing that we're not going to get it exactly right. Certainly not every time. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong more often. But as hard as it is to say, that's okay because we're learning. And as we navigate these challenges, we continue to learn and understand a little bit more. So earlier in the year, I attended a convening and I thought it was just so powerful. But the keynote speaker shared a quote that really stuck with me. And she said that if we wait until we reach our goal to celebrate, we may never celebrate. So we must celebrate our progress along the way. And of course, she was talking about like building movements and narrative building and like systemic change. But I think this applies here because we're learning. This is a learning journey, and we will deflate ourselves if we focus on our mistakes instead of really like honing in on the ways that we are improving. So we do want to make sure that we celebrate our progress, but recognize that we are going to make mistakes along the way. But let's dig deeper into get curious about yourself and others. So we wanted to share some specific strategies, and this is a big one. I mean, what does it really mean to get curious about yourself and others? This is literal. So we shared some literal examples of ways you can do this. It means learning about yourself. It means learning about your culture. It means learning about other cultures as well. And there's some specific ways that we can do this. Just visiting our local museum. I love that example because not only does it help you to learn about other cultures, but it helps you to learn about other cultures within your own community. Because those are typically the museums that you see in your community. I'm in South Carolina, and so our museums are very specific to South Carolina history and South Carolina cultures. But that helps us to learn about the people that are around us every day. I do want to note that this is not an exhaustive list. As a personal example, I remember subscribing to Ancestry.com in the past. This is about learning about yourself. It was so cool what I learned. And I think part of this experience is that I thought I knew, I thought I knew all of this information. I learned so much more about my family, about my culture, about my history. And it helped me to build a sense of pride, not only in myself, but in just the process of learning about oneself and how it feels to be connected to yourself in that way. And it mobilized me. It made me want to be more active whenever it came to championing my own community, but then also thinking about how others feel about their culture and wanting to champion that too. Before I move on, I do want to note the hot tip, which is that in the process, while we're learning about especially other cultures, just to remember that we want to make sure that we're respectful of other cultures when we're exploring. There are certain spaces that do not belong to us, and that's on purpose. And we want to make sure that when we're learning about other cultures that we are being genuine in how we approach this learning. We're not owed inclusion in certain spaces when it's specifically to serve a culture. And so I just wanted to note that point as well. All right. All right, treat others how they want to be treated. I always feel like I'm moving fast through these because there's so much to say, but But anyway, we have a lot to cover. So this is important. This is the second guidepost that came up. Growing up, I was always told to treat others how I want to be treated. But we have found that it's really important to let others guide how we treat them. And this is so important, especially for evaluators, because we're in a position to where we can demonstrate, we can actually show our respect for others by using strategies that ensure that people are recognized and appreciated, and that we are taking the intentional steps to demonstrate that respect. So we can show respect for experiences, we can share accurate stories, we can share space with those that are impacted by the work we do. And I'm going to get into some strategies now for how we can do this. And there's quite a few strategies here. Next slide, please. All right. There's quite a few here. But again, being mindful of the time, I'm going to try to move through them fairly quickly because I do want to hear your thoughts on what we share. One, we want to respect the audience's experience. This involves being mindful of the effects of systemic oppression, how it has created challenges that are very real for marginalized groups that others don't experience, and how basically, well, put a pin in this because we're going to dig deeper into it, but we want to make sure that we are very intentional about being mindful and respecting the very real experiences that others have faced or communities have faced that we, especially those that we may not share. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can do that. Strategy 2, we want to respect each dimension of a person's identity. And we're specifically talking about intersectional experiences. I really feel like this goes hand in hand with strategy 1. But it's just so important to recognize that our identities are multifaceted. There are people that experience marginalization exponentially. If it were quantifiable, I tend to be a math leaning person. So exponentially they are experiencing it, meaning they could be dealing with or experiencing challenges in this system because of their racial identity, gender identity, religious identity, other cultural identity, all at the same time. And we as evaluators have the power to actively respect each dimension of a person's identity. And it really shows their humanity. And I could spend a lot of time on this. I have my own personal experiences with this one as well. But there's so many great examples in the guide of how we can show this respect and be very, very respectful and cautious and intentional about how we show that respect. Number 3 is to make our content easy to find, understand, and use. And we hope we demonstrated that with this guide. But accessibility is so important, and we hear it all the time. But it's just a reminder that we want to make sure that what we communicate is communicated in a way that it can be received by others. And that's not just about being able to access it, but it's also about being able to engage with it. And so what language we use and how we develop and share out our products, is it in a way that can resonate and actually be engaged with our audience? That's very, very important. All right. Yes, let's dig deeper into how to show respect for our audience's experiences. These are some tactical ways that we can approach this. Again, I'm going to move quickly because I could talk about this all day long. And I hope we get to talk about it on the other end during the question section. Using asset-based framing. And what we mean by that is just centering people in the solution rather than victim blaming. So this also goes back to showing respect, right? Of course, showing respect for the audience's experience, showing respect for intersectional experiences. That's what this is about. We coexist with a lot of different groups of people with different identities, and their identities have been, their experiences have been negative in this system based on the way that that things have happened historically. We want to use our reporting to identify ways to challenge that system, the systems that have created these experiences, not to justify the oppression. And so that's one way, focusing on the system and how to address the system. Number two is focusing on behavior or condition rather than labeling. So we can highlight an individual's humanity rather than limiting them to one particular aspect of their life. I always like to give the example of my daughter. Her name is Ryan. Of course, I'm biased, but I think she's a doll. But she has autism. Autism is just a part of who she is. It's a part of her, it's a part of the way that she thinks and navigates the world. She is so much more than one condition that she has. And so I always am able to, this one is something that resonates with me because I can see it. I know what it's like to think about having, when I'm describing or talking about my daughter, autism is not the first thing I think about. I think about all of the other things about her. And so that's just one example of how we can focus on behavior or condition rather than labeling. 3, build power by creating choice. We hear of this a lot. Autonomy is huge. I mean, a great way to do this is to allow people to self-identify. We're in a current political climate, tensions are high. The last time that we had this conversation, tensions have risen even higher from that conversation. It's like continuing to increase. And a lot of the tensions are around this argument about how people choose to identify. We can respect the audience by giving them the choice to identify in the way that they would like to identify. Some people reject labels, as an example, such as Latinx. I remember growing up, there was a discussion about using African American versus Black. I identify as Black. Some people choose to identify as African American. When we ask people how they wish to identify, we can respect them by giving them the choice to tell us how they would like to be identified. And then number 4 is using nonviolent language. And I think this is a challenging one because our language is so rooted in violent rhetoric and that we may not even realize just how triggering our words could be for those, especially for people that have experienced violence. So I will wait because there tends to be a lot of good questions at the end about, or a lot of questions about how to use this or how this comes up. One example that comes to my mind is that I very much struggle now to say, like, I'm going to shoot you an email. It feels funny to me to say it because I have learned more about kind of the way that our language has been used. And some of the things that are said that have been more violent in nature that we didn't even, I mean, we've been saying it for years, so we haven't thought about it. But we do have some great resources as well that can like help us to think about maybe what it is that we're saying and how we can shift our language and be a little more cautious when it comes to just using less violent language. All right, now again, I could talk forever. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Alissa and she can talk more about the final 2 guideposts.
Yeah, thank you. So our third guidepost is centering marginalized people, voices, and experiences. And so, the reality is a lot of the times it's our voices as evaluators that are telling the stories of people who are part of our evaluation. And those tend to be in the social sector, right? Stories of people who are marginalized, and stories about the impact of oppression that they're experiencing. So the most important thing that we can do to ensure that our communications are equitable is to use that power, use the power that we have as evaluators and amplify the voices of the people whose stories that we're telling. So our research led us to 2 strategies to practically think about and do that. And so one is relinquishing our power. right? Like, do we have to be the person who's presenting the findings? Is that always the best choice and appropriate? Are there opportunities to bring people who contributed to the evaluation to help tell their stories directly? What could that look like, right? Is that even a question that we ask ourselves often as we're finishing up an evaluation? So that's one way to think about it. Another is maintaining the emotional intensity of people's experiences. I'm going to dig into that again in a second. A second strategy is compensating and sharing learnings with those people who are contributing to evaluations. I think I've been seeing a lot more conversation in the field right now about compensation policies. Our org is working on a compensation policy right now. If any of you have a great compensation policy that you like and that is something that you're willing to share, I'd love to see it. Please feel free to share. But I think that is something important to think about, is like, what really are we asking folks to do and how do we recognize them for that work, right? Like compensating not just for contributing data and insights, but also contributing to how those insights can be translated to be used, right, in the way that we communicate about them. We also want to think about, where our communications are directed to, who's the audience. Are we communicating to the people who can best use this information? And our goal at the end of the day really should be to create platforms that can amplify the people who are most affected by the work, right? And if we change our mindset or just have that thought as we're thinking about sharing out our findings, about how do we make sure that we're making something that is useful for people who are most affected by this issue, so that we're not exploiting them and their information for someone else who wants it for whatever their personal reasons are. I think that can really affect the way that we think about our reporting and the way that we're sharing back findings. Well, I mentioned kind of this piece around emotional intensity. And that's the first part of the first strategy of stepping aside. And so often when we use people's stories as data, their stories can get very watered down, right? Like we remove feelings from the data so that we can emphasize the facts. And I think that this really hurts us because we're all humans. We're telling a human story, and emotions are a really important part of that human experience, and it's part of what makes our stories real and true and authentic. And I experienced this once myself when I was working on a case study of a community advocacy group, and they had a really negative experience with a program lead. To the point where they really felt like that lead's actions were harmful to them, and they were volunteers on this. And I shared back a draft of the case study that I was working on as part of our evaluation. And they were so mad. They were so mad on this call. Even though I had included everything that they had shared with me. I included the program lead. Like they were up front and center as a challenge factor to their engagement in the initiative. But what they helped me understand is that their experience was not authentically captured, right? Like they did not feel heard from our conversations in like how bad it was and how the effect that harmful lead really had on them. And that wasn't fully captured in what I was sharing. And so thankfully, this was just a draft. It hadn't been shared out externally. So we were able to correct that and really emphasize. I think I dedicated like a whole page afterwards to kind of like their experience with that lead in this shorter report. And so, it was able to be improved, but it's so avoidable if I had just thought of their emotion as almost a data point to think about what does that mean and what does that tell us about the experience and the effect of what is happening in this program. So just keep that in mind of like, what is the emotion that is happening as you're collecting data, and how does that translate into the way that you're communicating, not watering it down. All right, the final guidepost we have to share is using anti-racist strategies to further equity. We can use language and images to shift minds and behaviors towards more equitable practices. So in other words, communications itself can be a tool for equity. And two strategies to do this. One is telling the whole honest story. And this means being explicit about race, talking about current and historical contexts and systems, and making sure we're capturing the positive and not just the negative in stories, and vice versa. We can also create solidarity by finding common threads, right? This I think is particularly important in today's day and age. Shelli mentions, like, feels like our society is becoming increasingly polarized. So when we're thinking about communicating with equity in mind, we want to find those common threads, like what can bring people together towards common goals instead of bringing us apart. And so one way to do that is leading with values and the vision for a better world, because that's something that a lot of people can get under one umbrella around, right? Something we can agree on. You can also be more relatable by making sure you're grounding data in storytelling, sharing how individuals are affected, because emotions are something that we can all connect around because we all have them and experience them. And the third is using messages to build alliances, right? Like you may have heard about wedge strategies. And so we want to do the opposite. We want to choose messages that can bring connections between groups and not pit them against each other. So I want to dig a little deeper into kind of this idea of making sure that the whole story is told. And part of that is talking about strengths and stories that inspire. And I think actually Shelli does a better job than me at telling this. So I'm going to turn to you to share that story.
I think Alissa does a great job at this as well, but one way to do this is, again, to tell stories that inspire. And what this is it involves thinking about how those that are affected by the information you are sharing, how they feel about what it is that you're sharing, and how that feeling or distress could potentially lead to an action, or just be added stress on that person or that group. So one reason why I share this is because of my personal example right now. As a mother, I'm a mother to two, about to be three children. One is 18, one is 8. I cannot tell you how distressing it can be to constantly hear about the dangers that Black women face with maternal and child health. But now I'm feeling it even more because I'm expecting. And the closer that I get, just quite close at this point, to having my third child, I'm feeling not just the joy and the celebration and excitement that you should feel when you're in the stage of life, but I also have that fear because the constant discussion really is about poor health outcomes when it comes to maternal and child health, especially for Black women. And they're not just stories for me, they're realities. There's an added fear that I have because it could be my reality. I could be a part of the negative statistics. And so now what we're suggesting here isn't that we overlook these realities, because these are really important conversations to be had. And the work that's being done to help Black women when it comes to maternal and child health is huge. And if it weren't for these stories, we wouldn't be having these conversations. But there are a lot of positive stories to be shared as well. For example, there are a lot of Black women working as doulas and OBGYNs to support these challenges The amount of Black women that are in this field that are doing work and have mobilized because of their own experiences is huge. And when I think about that, that makes me feel safe. It makes me feel safe during this time. And it makes me want to think about the ways that I can contribute to this positive narrative, and that there are women that I could help down the line with the skills that I have. So it's mobilizing. And the takeaway here is that those inspirational stories, those strengths, are important to help mobilize and promote change too. So just being considerate of the fact that there are very real people at the ends of these stories and the work that we're doing. And we want to make sure to tell stories that inspire. Next slide, please. All right. So what's next? What is this about? Right before we jump into the questions, we have one final point that we want to bring into light that can kind of help to bring these strategies into context. So we shared a lot today, and this is still just a small blip of the points that are shared in the guide. So we know this is a lot, and we wanted to spend the last few minutes just kind of reiterating what this is all about, and to really use this to be a call to action. We hope that you leave this webinar feeling motivated to continue or begin your journey into equitable communications. And it doesn't require these huge, lofty changes. There are several small ways that you can get started. Educating yourself and others on equitable communications is a big one. Share the knowledge, share the wealth. What you learn, please keep it going forward. Advocating for equitable communications, being brave when you're advocating for the people that have contributed to the evaluation, making sure that their voice is heard, being willing, like Alissa said, to step aside when you can, and adopting a learning mindset and starting where you can. Keep learning. We started at different points ourselves. We recognize that this is a journey that we're all on. We have not perfected it. We do not feel that way. No one has, or else we wouldn't still be actively in this work. But most importantly, what you learn, please share it back with us, because we want to be in community with you through this work. All right. So with that, we'd like to share the Equitable Comms Guide with you again. It was developed with guidance written specifically for evaluators. And there's so many more strategies in there that we think you will find hopefully useful to achieve these goalposts. But with that, we want to get to some questions. So what questions came up for you all today?
And just as a reminder, you can unmute, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand, you can put your question in the chat, whatever works better for you.
Lori in the Eval Cafe room, and I'm gonna just share off. I was supposed to hi to everybody in the room. I didn't get to say that earlier. I wanted to, in addition to just those strategies that you shared, I wanted to share an experience I had that was super eye-opening. I had been working on a book, and the publisher, in addition to having a copy editor and proofreader, had a DEI editor, and that. We were all good on grammar and complete sentences and organization and all that. But it was so eye-opening in terms of some of the things they pointed out that I was doing that, as you mentioned, a lot of us are completely oblivious to, like a lot of these violence reference, die on that hill, we're going to battle this, we're going to target that group. There's just so much of that. So that was super eye-opening. And then another one that they pointed out that really struck me was questioned me, like, are you using mainstream to mean white? And I was like, oh crap, I think I am using mainstream to mean white, because I was talking about the history of evaluation and its whiteness and things like that. So just having that one time was so great. So I think if anyone is in an opportunity to seek out a DEI editor, it just illuminated so much for me. So anyway, thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm really excited about looking at the guidebook. And while I have the floor, does anyone in the room have a question while we have the mic on?
I have a comment.
Please.
Okay, you can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that I appreciate can I put this closer? That I appreciate the comment about I forget your name, but you're about being pregnant and you don't need to hear like all of the negative things about birth outcomes because like that this exists and like that sort of steals your own joy like from that experience. And so I appreciate that because I feel like I sit on like doing the bad thing that you're not supposed to do of like, well, do you know about this terrible outcome that your race and ethnicity is X, Y, and Z, and I don't think about that that's probably like part of that person's like lived experience. You assume that people don't know. And so yeah, I just appreciated having that pointed out.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it's hard to share because it's personal, but I think the personal stories that we bring out really help to show how it hits home, that effect, and it helps us to think about how we can just even think about the way that we're communicating and how that there are very real people on the end. Even if it's not our community, there are still very real people on the end of what we share. And it looks like someone had a question that actually touched on that in the chat about how to maneuver this dilemma when let me just read it. It says, maintaining emotional intensity of people's experiences is not usually appreciated by organizations like Charity Navigator or Charity Intelligence. Unfortunately, if we don't water down their intensity, it seems like we're watering down our objectivity as evaluators. Any ideas on how to maneuver this dilemma as evaluators? I do want to call out too, because this is a challenging balance, right? Being able to say like, no, please fund these initiatives, please do this work, don't stop. We're not saying that it's not necessary. However, there are people at the end of this that this is their reality, and it's scary, and there are a whole lot of different public health issues oftentimes, but a lot of different issues that we're working towards that are very serious. And I think the balance is the important part. Anywhere where we can add the stories that inspire, because we still have to tell the truth. If we have the opportunity to add those stories, those inspirational stories, and just make sure that we're even coupling them. There are a lot of people in this work. However, this is something we're working on. This is what's happening here. This is great. But so here's where we need to go next. I think right now, a lot of times we just hear the negative and we don't get to hear the inspiring stories as often. And so I think that's really important. Alissa, do you have any thoughts on that too? Because then we hear about
Yeah,
it.
I love the question because I think it does bring up some of the tension that we feel as evaluators in this space, where there are certain like historical expectations on us to like be objective, be like, bringing the science behind programs. And I think that puts us in a really hard position sometimes because we are working with people who have feelings and emotions and experiences, and those are also real and they need to be represented. And like one thing I think about when I look at this is, what's the difference between the data that we're sharing back and our interpretation of that data? So when we're sharing back the data, like that's not our story. Like we don't have to worry about our objectivity because we're just communicating a message. This is the message that we got and we are hearing. And this is like the true authentic experience that someone had, and it was powerful. And then we can have an interpretation where, we can share back, like, what are we seeing in that because of the powerful experience that they had in this program? What does that mean for the work? What recommendations might we suggest based on this? And I think like those are two pieces to think about as you're building in and sharing back your findings of, you know, how can you uplift people's stories and like their true experiences? Because yeah, those aren't fully our own. They can guide us. And how do we be true to those stories as we're hearing them? Yeah. I do want to shout out one thing too, you know, as we're talking about like you and your personal story, Shelli, too, and stories that inspire. And as I was listening to that, you know, exchange, the thing that came to mind was like how hard this really is, right? Like this is very personal. And it is something that requires bravery sometimes to like get so real. But because of your bravery to share that story today, Shelli, like to give that detail, to share kind of your feelings around it, to bring that emotion in, that had such a greater impact, I think, on understanding like the message that we were trying to share, just like get a little meta about our presentation, right? And that's true as we're sharing findings back from our evaluation as well. It's like who shared their stories was brave enough to like really let loose, who can have an impact too on sharing the message of, you know, how this program is working and what is not, or, you know, whatever your mission is and goals and your evaluation, like who are some of the messages who can like messengers who can like support in telling that story and like bring some of that emotion to it too.
Mhm. Yeah,
You
thank
and Mike has his hand up. Mike, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Thanks again so much for that presentation. It's great, thank you. So as you were talking, and especially when you were talking about, you know, providing space for participants to self-identify, I think that really resonated with me because, you know, it's really easy to report demographics and even talk about, you know, subsets of populations and samples that are affected in this way or the other based on the data. But my thought while you were talking about that, especially like Shelli, when you were talking about being a Black mother, like right now I can see that you're a Black woman, but I couldn't see that you were a Black mother on camera. But to you, that's a very salient part of your identity. But that's not really that's not always going to be on a demographic form for, you know, a survey that we're going to be using for evaluation. You know, for myself, I'm a white man. I also happen to be gay. That's not something that you can see on the screen. That's probably not going to be a question that's asked on a survey, but it is a salient part of my life. My question is that during your research into kind of how to communicate these issues, have you come across anything about asking about self-identification that's salient to the topic at hand, I guess? Like what, does that question make sense? If not, I'll try to explain it a little bit better.
It does make sense. I'm going to let you start us off on this one, this part, Alissa, on self-identification.
Sure. I think that's a good question. And I think self-identifying, it's really tricky because like how big is your sample, right? Like what does that really mean and do? And one thing I think about related to that is like what is our due diligence on that, and like and what level do we need to do? It is a balance, and two ways I like to think about it, and tell me if this answers your question, feel free to jump in, Shelli. But one thing is when we're getting down to the individual, we can ask individuals. So if we're like quoting someone and saying, you know, oh, you know, someone had this experience and they're a Black mother. Let's check in with them, right? Like if that's a relevant piece of the identity to share, which in many programs it is, then how do they want to be identified in that thing when it's completely their own? Like you're quoting them, like how do they want to be identified? When you're thinking on a larger scale, I don't think it's possible. Like you cannot like represent everyone and everyone's personal preferences and the way that works. So you have so many different choices in how to approach that. One potential way you could do is to you know, reach out and connect with a small sample of the folks that you engage with to figure out what are their preferences. They may not agree. And in that case, you know, what is the best choice? Maybe there's a majority of people who kind of chose one way that they identified. Maybe, you know, it's kind of so fraught, like sometimes identities can be, you know, like politically charged. So in that case, maybe you want to get people together to like come to agreement on how the report can like talk about a certain population. And I think the bottom line is like you're being intentional about it, you're checking in, and then you're making it explicit. I think include a part in your like report of like how did you come up with this? You know, because it's an acknowledgement that not everyone uses the specific language that you're using in a report, but it does acknowledge that like you know that, and maybe there's, you know, like you're using Black, but some people might choose African American, and so you can kind of explain and define how you came up with what you did and still recognize the different identities and language that people prefer.
I agree. I don't think I have anything to add to that. And we have a colleague that we worked with, Jonathan Schwabish, and I'm thinking about his some of the things that I've learned from him just from our working together. But I do think having an opportunity or a space for someone to add in how they would like to identify, even though it is more time, it is messy. And so we're recognizing that that means that we would have to take a little bit more time to make sure that that feedback is incorporated, but giving that space could be very meaningful. And there are different ways to ask too, so we don't have to always say other. Like when I was thinking about John, I was thinking about the fact that he uses different language instead of just sticking with the traditional terms that we use. But yeah, I think that creates space for self-identification as well.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question, and there's actually one in the room. So I'm going to send it back over to the room. I don't want to interrupt the question time, but I will go ahead and just like pop the information about our October 2nd Eval Cafe in the chat. If anybody's interested, hopefully we'll see you then. And I'll hand it over to the room.
Yeah, my name is John. I'm here. Just a follow-up to the last question and the explanation. The U.S. Census Bureau has put up a new classification based on demographic data on how to self-identify people when you're collecting data. So I think that resources is kind of useful to those who want to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
Much, yeah. Try to find that and put it in the chat. I think there's so many great resources out there. There's more in the guide that we put out. I linked another one. But please keep them coming because I think we're all trying to like learn and figure out how to do this well. And yeah, we're gonna stumble along the way, so we can only learn from each other.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate your time, the effort, and the amazing guide that you made. And thank you everybody for attending and participating. And we hope to see you back here again in 2 weeks, but I think you're right. I think the conversation is definitely ongoing, and hopefully we can reach out to each other with any resources, references, and thank you everybody for your time today.
Thank you all. So glad to be here.
Yeah.